Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving by Peter Walker. We are, before we began on Suicidal Ideation, which is ideation, that's the word, where we left off. I just wanted to tell you a bit about my experience in the last several days. My mind has been infiltrated with memories, as obviously is going to be happening to you if you do this. Series is going to be bringing up a lot of things. And again, I want to suggest that you acknowledge them. You welcome them in, you don't deny them, because what we resist will persist. And so welcome them in, say hello, and then kind of tack them up in a board in your mind where you can see it all but not be overwhelmed by it. Don't go into a rabbit hole, please and thank you. Also, one thing that I noticed, which is to me the cosmic universe actually allowing synchronicities to occur, because by moving this energy we are able to direct it in either a positive or a negative way for us. And if it goes positive, then it's not just for us, it's for helping those around us, which now in the last week it's been 2 different friends in different ways. One was personal, and then the other one was assistance with something she was dealing with in her family. It was of great value and importance to her. And so I was able to speak about my past experiences to try to shed light in what she was processing. And with my other friend, I was able to listen and be able to comprehend and do my best to aid from my experience, which apparently did help. So that sort of synchronicity as I start this work is apparent to me as a thumbs up from the universe, as it were. So if that starts happening to you, where people are all of a sudden coming to you with the same level of shadow work that they're dealing with, it's very tempting to shut down and go, oh, I'm dealing with my own shit right now. I don't need nor have space to deal with other people's. But it has often been proven true to me that in order to prevent rabbit holes, the best thing to do is just remember this. My first pastor ever, Pastor Floyd, showed me this. Here's the cross, right? Cross the I out of your mental world if you're in stress. Just cross yourself out by helping somebody else, and it will relieve some of that stress. So now to begin where we left off. Suicidal ideation is a common phenomenon in complex PTSD, particularly during intense or prolonged flashbacks. Now remember, these emotional flashbacks could last up to weeks, if not longer, if you get stuck in it. Suicidal ideation is depressed thinking or fantasizing about wanting to die. It can range from active suicidality to passive suicidality. Passive suicidality is far more common with the complex PTSD survivor who I have known, and it ranges from wishing you were dead to fantasizing about ways to end your life. When lost in suicidal ideation, the survivor may even pray to be delivered from this life, or fantasize about being taken by some calamitous or causing great suffering act of fate. Earthquake, flood, lightning strike. He may even think or obsess, without being serious, of stepping in front of a car or jumping off a building. Fantasy typically ends, however, without a serious intent to kill yourself. This is opposed to active suicidality, where the person is actively proceeding in the direction of taking her life. I am discussing passive suicidality because it does not merit the same kind of alarm as active suicidality. Passive suicidality is typically a flashback to early childhood when our abandonment was so profound that it was natural for us to wish that God or somebody or something would just put an end to it all. My experience with that was, I think the last time I tried to kill myself as a teenager, I was 16. And it was like, I think it was passive because I was tempting it, but like in ways that, well, I didn't have any weapons or anything like that. But the last time I was like 16, the last time I attempted as a young person, teenager. There goes my dog. I'm not gonna yell. He's gonna come back. It's gonna be okay. Anyway, was when I was trying to get a bunch of those packets from my mom's shoe boxes that have say poison on it, and I was just gonna swallow a grip of them. I'm not sure if that's passive, but I think that's what it was because I didn't do it. But that's the best I could do at that time. So I'm sure if you have those type of experiences, go ahead and put them in the comments so that other people can remember that sort of thing without any sort of toxic shame. Like, you know, it was this that we're reading about. Passive suicidality is typically a flashback to early childhood when our abandonment was so profound that it was natural for us to wish that God or somebody or something would just put an end to it all. And actually what ended up ending that attempt, which is why I remember it so much, even though I wasn't a person of faith and God and I didn't talk, was that in the midst of that, so sure, packets of poison in my hands, glass of water next to me, crying and so like upset about everything that was happening to me at the time, the sexual abuse that was happening at the time. I just got overwhelmed by the voice of God, angels, higher selves, whatever it is that you want to label it. Something outside of myself was suddenly speaking to me within myself. And I made an agreement, a pact, that, okay, I will continue to have a shit childhood and that'll be fine. But by the time I'm an adult, I will have a fabulous life. Okay, deal. I also said that, you know, my kids would have a wonderful life and that would be a perfectly good trade-off. I will have this shit experience for however, you know, at that point 16 years, and I will have a good adulthood. Well, I'm 41, so that's the most adult you can get. So yeah, I guess the pact worked. God or somebody or something would just put an end to it all. When the survivor catches himself in a suicidal reverie, he will benefit from seeing it both as an emblem of how much pain he is in and as a sign of a particularly intense flashback. This then can direct him to use the flashback management steps that we talked about in the beginning. So go back, if you've seen this out of order, go back to the beginning of this series, which is the introduction to the in-depth of shadow work, and that will give you what they're talking about here, the flashback management steps. There's 13 of them. If, however, flashback management does not help and suicidality becomes increasingly active, please call the National Suicide Hotline, and it gives the number here, and I'll put that in the description, or visit, and it gives the website, and I'll put both of those in the description, because this is a flashback that you may need help managing, and you will get good help there. And my experience with suicidal hotlines was of great value. I remember I was, as an adult, going through the depths of hell. I was really wanting to go to the police to report my sexual abuser, and here I was 35, the abuse had ended at 17, and I was finally going to try to encourage myself to go there. But every time I tried to go to the police station, I would end up pulled over, pulling myself off the road and crying hysterically, calling my husband at the time. And he actually put me on hold because it was so bad, and called a suicide hotline, and they patched that through. And I ended up talking to this person on the side of the road there, and they hooked me up with another group from rainn, which is another very good group for sexual abuse survivors. And through that, I ended up getting connected with people that were sexual abuse survivors, that what they do is they connect with you and actually go with you to the police station and sit with you during the process, and the police lets them come into the interview room with you, and they are just sitting there for support as someone that has just done what I was about to do there. And I was able to get through that horrendous event of 2.5 hour police interview. And that lady that I only met that one day was there for me, and I was able to get through it. And it was because of my husband at the time contacting professionals and patching me through to talk to them. So, you know, if you ever hear the suicidal hotline, blah, 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 and you think it's BS, and you know, they all may not be great, but God willing, you'll get someone that I got that totally did help me, and I was able to actually get through the suicidal ideation, and get the support I needed, the outside support that I needed to go to the police station and make that police report. And so it's possible. So don't be an island. Reach out for help. And when you can, be that help to others. Because this is a flashback that you may need help managing, and you will get good help there. Again, I'll put that website and that hotline in the description of this video. Skilled therapists and caregivers learn to discriminate between active and passive suicidal ideation, and do not panic and catastrophize when encountering the latter. Instead, the counselor invites the survivor. Well, that's a good point. Not to interrupt again, but it's important to realize that if you have, like me, I was going to my husband and he could not handle any of it. And he was wise enough to get me professional help that could handle it. So, and here, you know, I just wanted my husband to help me with this, be there at the police station with me, and he couldn't do it. And that's not, I'm not judging or comparing. I'm just saying that he couldn't do it. He just couldn't. So, and he wasn't a professional. He hadn't been sexually abused. So instead, he got me help for people that could do that. So that help is out there. You just have to love yourself enough to seek it out, or accept help from other people trying to give you that information. Skilled therapists and caregivers learn to discriminate between active and passive suicidal ideation, and do not panic and catastrophize when encountering the latter. Instead, the counselor invites the survivor to explore his suicidal thoughts and feelings, knowing that in most cases, verbal ventilation of the flashback pain underneath it will deconstruct the suicidality. In the much less common scenario of active suicidality, encouraging verbal ventilation will also help the therapist or helper discern if there is indeed a real risk, and if action needs to be taken to protect the survivor. What you may have been misdiagnosed with. I once heard renowned traumatologist John Breyer quip that if complex PTSD were ever given its due, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which, by the way, last I remember was in its 6th version, used by all mental health professionals, would shrink from its dictionary-like size to the size of a thin pamphlet. In other words, The role of traumatized childhoods in most adult psychological disorders is enormous. I have witnessed many clients with complex PTSD misdiagnosed with various anxiety and depressive disorders. Moreover, many are also unfairly and inaccurately labeled with bipolar, narcissistic, codependent, autistic spectrum, and borderline disorders. I talked about this in the last video. So yeah, that's what they do. I went from like 8, 9 different diagnoses down to 2 once I got complex PTSD as my diagnosis. It does help not to have a zillion of them. This is not to say that complex PTSD does not sometimes co-occur with these disorders. Further confusion also arises in the cause of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Yeah, that was one of my diagnoses. As well as obsessive compulsive disorder, both of which are sometimes more accurately described as fixated flight responses to trauma. Makes sense to me. It's one of the things I learned when I was diving into ADHD, trying to figure out how to cope with my disorder, since they labeled me as having a disorder. ADHD, to me, after some rather awesome, what was his name? Dr. Gabor. Dr. Gabor. Just put Gabor. He's this Polish man, older, and he doesn't think that ADHD is this described as hyperactive disorder. It's he thinks it's just traumatized children running amok because they're on hyper mode, because they're constantly waiting to get raped or beat or put down or neglected. And so they're constantly, as they described it here, this fixated flight response that ends up looking like ADHD. This is also true of ADD, attention deficit disorder, and some depressive and dissociative disorders, which similarly can more accurately be described as fixated freeze responses to trauma. So, we got freeze. When you stop, when trauma is happening, you just freeze, or you fight, or you flight as you get the hell out of there, or you fawn, which is like you'll say whatever just to make it stop. Furthermore, this is not to say that those so misdiagnosed do not have issues that are similar and correlative, existing because of something, with the disorder above. The key point is that these labels are incomplete and unnecessarily shaming descriptions of what the survivor is actually afflicted with, which is trauma, which is hurt, which is abandonment, which is trauma. Reducing complex PTSD to a quote-unquote panic disorder is like calling food allergies chronically itchy eyes. Over-focusing treatment on the symptoms of panic in the former case and eye health in the latter does little to get at root causes. Feelings of panic or itchiness in the eyes can be masked with medication, but all the associated problems that cause these symptoms will remain untreated, which is why I chose to get off all those medications that they gave me for depression and anxiety and ADHD, etc., because ultimately they were just covering up the symptoms and not doing anything about the problem. Moreover, most of the diagnoses mentioned above are typically treated as innate characterological defects rather than as learned maladaptations to stress. Adaptations that survivors are forced to learn as traumatized children. And Most importantly, because these adaptations were learned, they can often be extinguished or significantly diminished and replaced with more functional adaptations to stress. We build up our emotional toolbox so we can choose our response, choose our point of view, and not get stuck in places that we're taught and learned as tiny children. In this vein, I believe that many substance and process addictions also begin as misguided maladaptations to parental abuse and abandonment. They are early adaptations that are attempts to soothe and distract from the mental, emotional, and physical pain of complex PTSD. See, I did meth for 14 years. I was sexually abused for 14 years. And by the time my meth addiction ended, it was because my body couldn't keep inside everything, all the emotional fuckery that was happening. The drugs stopped working. They actually started giving me anxiety. And before that, the amount of meth that I was using was working as ADHD medicine because they're in the same family chemically. And what did that mean? That meant that I didn't have nightmares. I was such a busy person. I was doing so much set construction for theater and doing so many leads and shows and had 2 jobs and, had my own place and everything else that I just kept myself busy. And the drugs kept me going. And I didn't have to think about anything from the past or process any emotions. That was my way of bypassing all that. And once a certain age, once I got married and I went quote unquote back home by being in a marriage, it all came undone. And the nightmares began and nothing else could hold it back. And I started therapy and they started bringing all this stuff up and it was a hailstorm. So yeah, I can tell you from my own experience that the meth addiction that I had definitely acted like any other ADHD medicine would. Kept my emotions covered up. Origins of complex PTSD. How do traumatically abused or abandoned children develop complex PTSD? While the origins of complex PTSD is most often associated with extended periods of physical and or sexual abuse in childhood, my observations convince me that ongoing verbal and emotional abuse also cause it. Needless to say, all 4. Many dysfunctional parents react contemptuously to a baby or toddler's plaintive call for connection and attachment. Contempt is extremely traumatizing to a child, and at best, extremely noxious to an adult or harmful to living things. That's what the word noxious means. Extremely noxious to an adult. Contempt is a toxic cocktail of verbal and emotional abuse. A deadly amalgam. Amalgam is a mixture of different things. Of denigration or a comment that is not kind, rage, and disgust. That's why contempt hurts so bad. The last time my mother and I were in front of each other, the last look she gave me was one of contempt. It was her go-to. So it seemed appropriate, I guess. Rage creates fear, and disgust creates shame in the child in a way that soon teaches her to refrain from crying out, from ever asking for attention. Before long, the child gives up on seeking any kind of help or connection at all. The child's bid for bonding and acceptance is thwarted, and she is left to suffer in the frightened despair of abandonment. Particularly abusive parents deepen the abandonment trauma by linking corporal punishment with contempt. Yep. Slaveholders and prison guards typically use contempt and scorn to destroy their victims' self-esteem. Slaves, prisoners, and children who are made to feel worthless and powerless devolve into learned helplessness and can be controlled with far less energy and attention. Cult leaders also use contempt to shrink their followers into absolute submission after luring them in with brief phases of fake, unconditional love. Keyword fake. Furthermore, complex PTSD can also be caused by emotional neglect alone. Is there anything worse than being ignored? I don't think so. If you notice that you are berating yourself because your trauma seems insignificant compared to others, please skip ahead to this chapter and resume reading here upon completion. What chapter? Oh. Furthermore, complex PTSD can also be caused by emotional neglect alone. This key theme is explored at length in Chapter 5, which we'll eventually get to. If you notice that you're berating yourself because your trauma seems insignificant compared to others, please skip ahead to this chapter and then resume reading here upon completion. Emotional neglect is also typically underlies most traumatizations that are more glaringly evident. Parents who routinely ignore or turn their backs on a child's call for attention, connection, or help abandon their child to unmanageable amounts of fear, and the child eventually gives up and succumbs to depressed, death-like feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. What this looked from my own experience, write yours in the comments so that other people know that, yeah, we can all communicate about this with each other so that we can feel a little more sane, get rid of some more of that shame, was that I would stare at the wall. I would just stare at walls at home, and found myself doing that a lot. When I wasn't reading to try to get out of my existence. But I'd stare at the wall and I desperately try to form a future that was happy. But there was a lot of holes there because I didn't know what that looked like outside of TV. And I didn't know what I liked or didn't like, because I was subject to whatever was happening around me, and there wasn't a lot of exterior experiences outside of the home because I was just pretty much kept at home. I think the first vacation we took, I was already had already moved out and was an adult. So I already had my own place. I was way out of the house by then. And my mom's like, "Oh, let's go on vacation because that's something I need to do now, and you need to come." And I was like, "Oh, cool." But that was all as an adult. As a child, I was just a lot of staring at the walls. Lots of staring at the walls. And lots of reading. I remember one time I finally gave up and sad. It was kind of lame. Sad. I mean, just even looking back, lame I should probably use a better word. It was trepidatious, I think is the word. Trepidatiously walked up to my mom and asked for a hug. I really wanted a hug from my mother, and she looked annoyed. She gave me a really quick hug, and it was like, and like pat, and that was it. And I didn't ask for hugs after that. That's why one of my favorite pictures ever of me and my mother is us sitting on her bed and somebody said we're going to take a picture, but because somebody said we were going to take a picture of mother and daughter, you know, I don't even know who took the picture, but she was like, okay, and she did this, you know, big huge hug, and I was so happy to be being hugged by her that I gave her this huge hug back. It was such a happy moment for me. But the second the picture was taken, it was like and yet still, whenever I think of my mother, it's that picture, that image that wasn't really real, that I always think of when I think of my mother, is that picture, that second in time. So just recognize those moments in your past. Don't go nosediving into them. Please don't do that to yourself. But recognize them, because that's the cause and effect of what happened to you. And those are the bits and pieces that you were able to, as a child, put together, and go back and parent yourself. Talk to yourself, journal with yourself about that, and understand that, you know, that wasn't lame. That was important. That was you trying. Now you can do a lot better now because you're an adult. So, moving on. The child eventually gives up and succumbs to depressed, death-like feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. These type of rejection simultaneously magnify the child's fear and eventually add a coating of shame to it. Over time, this fear and shame begets a toxic inner critic. Oh, that inner critic. I had critics. You have critics? Do you have a committee? I have a committee. I used to have a committee. That committee got fired. But yeah, a committee. Always imagine them in this big room with like huge table, all in suits, and mostly male. I don't know why. But yeah, it was a committee. Over time, this fear and shame begets a toxic inner critic and holds the child, and later the adult, totally responsible for his parents' abandonment, until he becomes his own worst enemy and descends into the bowels of complex PTSD. Now, this I'm just going to touch on. I'm sure they're going to talk about it in the book. But the most prominent example of that we just read, where the critic that holds the child and later the adult totally responsible for his parents' abandonment, was doing some inner child work in therapy. And during the worst times of it, I ended up losing 3 days. This happened to me twice in my life. Twice. And